particularly in New York City. And so we are very conscious in making that happen. And so take a look at that. And if you're interested in helping out in terms of ideas around programs and art things, again, talk to Kazembe or join the program committee. You know, you can join that program committee, and it's a great committee. You know, and make your contributions out of it. Are we ready, Kazembe?
Yes, we're ready, sir.
Okay, great. We got that off. We're here tonight to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the publication of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and also to commemorate its brilliant author, activist, Brother Walter Rodney. And with us is Feroz Manji, who was one of, he'll go into more detail on it. One of the founders of Pambazuka Press, Pambazuka Books, and there's a website in terms of news and analysis around Africa, and under the rubric of pambazuka.org, pambazuka.org. For those who don't know how to spell Pambazuka, it sounds, you spell it just the way it sounds, Pambazuka, okay, .org. And this is, it's a very important evening in terms of the commemoration of the 40th anniversary of an essential book that's still relevant today, and a brilliant scholar activist who lost his life through an assassination, a state-sponsored assassination in Guyana, because he was helping to organize the African population in Guyana and the Indian population. By the word Indian, I mean those from India, not the misnomer indigenous people of the Americas. Organizing in a united force in opposition to the neo-colonial structures that were in place at that time. And he was a very popular person, very charismatic, very popular, and before he was assassinated, he was producing books that explained to the folk in Guyana their respective histories. The history of African people in Guyana, the history of the indigenous people in Guyana, and the history of the Indian people in Guyana. That was a part of a public education project that they were undergoing in Guyana, and also organizing an oppositional party. So he was a very dangerous man to Mr. Burnham and the United States, and so he was assassinated. I don't have to go into the details of how he was assassinated, but he was assassinated. It was a big loss to all of us in this room, major loss. He was a very young man at the time, and he had so much more to do. So this book, Feroz will go into details on, is a breakthrough, milestone book, like Wretched of the Earth, Souls of Black Folk, right? Autobiography of Malcolm X. You have in that realm of importance, and even more so in a lot of ways, because it touches all of us folk of African descent throughout the diaspora. How Europe underdeveloped Africa resulted in me being born in Bed-Stuy. You know, so it touches all of us. It resulted in Walter Rodney being born in Guyana. So there is a subjective and objective component to this very, very important book. And I will not say any more. Let Feroz speak from here on.
Thanks, everyone. Good evening. Just out of interest, how many have read How You're Underdeveloped Africa? Okay, quite a few. That's great. Let me quote Angela Davis, who recently wrote a review of this book. And she says, Rodney's classic study of the impact of European capitalism on the continent of Africa continues to provoke, inspire, and educate. It resonates more than ever before. And I think that's really what I want to try to deal with this evening, is why this book resonates today more than ever before. I want to try to discuss its relevance to the struggles that are happening across the African continent and beyond, and suggest that the ideas that Rodney developed in this book are absolutely critical as a tool for grappling with our future and for developing an emancipatory, transformative politics for the future. Very briefly, I mean, this book has been republished here in the US by Black Classic Press. It's available at the back there, and by Pambazuka Press in the rest of the world. Together with the Walter Rodney Foundation and the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. To mark this anniversary, and because we feel that there's a whole generation of people who have been brought up without any knowledge of who Rodney was or what he wrote about, that we felt it was essential to try and bring out a new edition. The book is extraordinary in that it reasserts the history of Africa, not from the point of view of what academia and colonial societies, or even today, many Western perceptions about Africa. It reasserts a history which begins not with just at the point of connection between the European powers and Africa in the Atlantic slave trade, but more importantly, looking at how Africa was developing before that contact. He deals with, in great detail, an understanding of the complexities of these societies, not looking at it in a romantic way, but rather looking at the different forms of class formations and the trajectories that they were likely to go forward before they clashed with Europe with a terrifying and decimating interaction, starting with the slave trade and going on to the colonial venture. I think that one of the things I want to get across is that his principal argument has been that it was the integration of Africa into the world capitalist economy. He doesn't talk about just colonialism, but he talks about actually the underlying structural forms, how capitalism operated in the peripheries, how it actually sought to exploit, and how the extraction of human labor, how the exploitation of human labor, how the exploitation and grabbing of land, how the extraction of natural resources was a fundamental part of how capitalism operates in the periphery. And I think that's a really essential thing because it counters the prevailing dogmas of the development schools who consider development as something that is a good thing that's happening, but without a critique of understanding the nature of capitalist development in the peripheries. A development that leads to growth, as we've been told. A number of countries have huge growth in Africa, but growth combined with underdevelopment. In other words, those two components are not combined. We're living today in a, I mean, it's really, it's wonderful that this is the anniversary of Occupy. Because I think we're living in an incredibly exciting period in human history. It's a period in which it's a period which is pregnant with the twins, hope and despair. The hope is manifested by what you've seen in Zakota Park, what you've seen around Wall Street. That is the inspiration, that's what's going on. It's happening not only in the US, it's happening well beyond that. But despair also coexists, and I will try to give some ideas about why I think that is also happening. And if we think about what has happened in Iraq, in Afghanistan, what's threatening in Syria, in Iran, what has happened in Libya, what has happened in Cote d'Ivoire, in Somalia, and so on, we see hope's negative twin, that of posing a situation for humanity, which is a contention between emancipatory transformations or barbarism and potential destruction of the planet through climate change. Like Rodney, I think we have to accept the fact that the transformations that we need to be involved in making changes around us, we may not see the benefits of all of that in our lifetimes. I think it's one of the things that the left has perhaps learnt over the last 30 years is patience. That revolution is not going to happen just tomorrow, but it is starting today. And I think we have to understand and take a long-term, epochal view on this. Somebody told me at a conference I was just been at about Chou En-lai was asked about what he thought of the French Revolution, and he reflected a moment and he says, "I think it's a little early to tell yet." I want to try and deal with the sort of counterposing the hope versus barbarism with the usual way that Africa is portrayed of optimism versus pessimism. You know the old story about the optimist and pessimist. The pessimist was standing there looking across the African continent saying, look at it, there's killings, there's genocide, there's all these terrible things going on. You know, it just couldn't get worse. And the optimist turns around to me and says, cheer up, old boy, of course they could. As I said, I think we're living in an incredibly exciting period, and I think people sometimes don't necessarily appreciate the scale of things that have been going on. You've all heard of what the newspapers call the Arab Spring. Mm-hmm. People forget, of course, that Egypt and Tunisia, where the revolution broke out, are part of Africa. Mm-hmm. When I say they're part of Africa, mm-hmm. they're not just geographically part of Africa. They have a long, thousands of years of history of interaction with the societies across the continent. These were part of an African uprising, an African awakening, an African revolution. And I think it's very important to understand that the Egyptian empire used to stretch as far as Syria in the east and to the west of Libya in the west. The Ethiopian empire included the entire what we call Yemen today and beyond. So what people call the Arab world is part of our history, and it's part of Africa's history. And I think that's a really essential point to understand. But it's a really exciting period to be alive, because the kind of things, it's not just been Tunisia and Egypt that we have seen uprisings taking place in. The list is so long that I have to remind myself of the list. Just in the last 2 years, there have been significant uprisings, protests, mass organizing, which we've reported on in Pamasuka News, in Western Sahara, Zimbabwe, Senegal, Gabon, Sudan, Mauritania, Morocco, Madagascar, Mozambique, Algeria, Benin, Cameroon, Djibouti, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Botswana, Namibia, Uganda, Kenya, Swaziland, South Africa, Malawi, Uganda, and just a couple of weeks ago in Togo as well. So, you know, we are seeing something that is happening on a continental scale. I forgot 1 or 2 other countries. Spain, Greece, Scotty Park. These are part, I would suggest, of the same phenomenon. And I think the question that we have to ask is, why is this happening now? Are they related? Do they share the same etiology, the same causation? And I would argue that yes, indeed, they are. Looking from an African perspective, what we often forget is what was achieved during as a result of the uprisings that took place in the post-Second World War period that led to independence across the continent. That uprising began in the immediate post-Second World War period and was comprised of massive amounts of organizing in rural areas, in factories, in townships, and so on. And it was this movement that gave rise to a nationalist movement, which said to this movement, if you support us for so-called political independence, we will deliver all the things that you are crying out for. What happened in the 60s was the establishment of formal independence. One flag came down, another flag went up, but structurally very little changed in that. But that said, we have to recognize that whatever the shortcomings may have been of the post-independence governments, whatever the critique we may have of their despotism, their centrifugal force to keep everything under control, of a one-party state, and so on, and the kind of health services, education services they set up, whatever one might say about the critique of that, we have to start with an acknowledgement of the extraordinary transformation that they carried out in a period of less than 20 years. It's really important to recognize that. In most of these countries, there were no health services for African people. There was no education for African people. There was virtually no road transport except for the settler communities. There was virtually no infrastructure development at all at the point of independence. And yet within a space of 20 years, they transformed their countries to have a universal healthcare, universal education, access to water, and so on and so forth. It was an extraordinary achievement. Just to give some crude statistics, life expectancy at birth in Kenya at independence was 39 years. By 1980, it had reached 47. I mean, that kind of transformation is something really important to acknowledge, because it constituted, all these things constituted part of the gains of independence. They were our jewels. Limited though they may have been, they were part of what we gained. That's what we shed blood for. That's what we fought for during the anti-colonial wars. But then what happened? In the 1970s, we saw the development of a world economic crisis, a major recession. We saw the establishment of OPEC, the centralization control oil production by the oil-producing countries, the formation of OPEC. You saw a flood of money pouring into the cities of Europe and America, but you saw also very critically, and that was the delinking of the dollar from the gold standard. By doing so, it had a dramatic effect on all other currencies, a major devaluation of currencies across the world. Furthermore, in the period of the 60s and the rise of the establishment of independence, all the banks, all the finance houses were rushing around saying, borrow, borrow, borrow. What do banks do when they have lots of money to spend? They say, take out a mortgage. You know, sure. I want a house, have a house. Want a hospital, have a hospital. Want a bridge, have a bridge. But of course, by the time that the devaluation of their currencies took place and the emergence of what was called a debt crisis, and it was tied in such a way that repayment of debt, the interest on debt had to be made in dollars, not in local currency. And so you find this circular trap with a huge debt building up across African countries. You saw then the rise of Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Reagan in the US. And this marked the beginnings of the reestablishment of the neoliberal agenda, the right-wing agenda, which said, no, these governments, despite the fact that they transform health and education and so on, these governments were by definition were inefficient. Only the private sector could deliver. And so there was the borders and the economies of the countries were opened up to the voracious appetite of the corporations, which were free to go where they want, invest what they want, avoid taxes as they want, and simply exploit in every way. All the subsidies to the public sector were removed, healthcare and education and so on. Farmers who were especially the small farmers, who even today remain the major feeders of most of us, were no longer got the subsidy. There was no more cooperatives, no more marketing boards, and so they became victim to the advance of capital from the north. So, you know, a country like Ghana, which used to have a huge industry of chicken, were overnight transformed into a situation where they were forced to allow the Dutch to dump chicken on them. Why? Because the Dutch only like the white meat, so they dumped all the chicken legs and wings on the African population at prices which nobody could compete with. As a result, that whole industry collapsed. Today, of course, the NGOs go out there to teach them how to farm chickens. And that's what happened. There was the infrastructure of our countries, you know, where there was telecommunications, they were run down. Where there was transport, was run down. Train infrastructure was run down until it reached such low quality that it could be sold for a song and privatized. So we saw the beginnings of a massive privatization of the commons. That is something accelerated in the recent period, but it began at that point. And the result was a huge decline in living standards, a huge decline in the value of the wage, and return of life expectancy to figures that we had in the colonial times. We had unemployment at that kind of level. You had an increase in child mortality, increase in maternal mortality, and so on. All these major parameters began to deteriorate. It sounds like I'm saying that, you know, this was just done to Africa. It was done in collusion with our own so-called leaders. who understood and realized that they could get a cut of the cake by doing so. And so we saw a massive destruction of the economies, and we saw a dispossession of land, we saw a dispossession of our living wage, a dispossession of the commons. But probably the most serious dispossession that is very rarely commented upon, the most serious dispossession that took place over a 30-year period starting from the 1980s, was the dispossession, or it was a political dispossession. Our governments had become more accountable to the international financial institutions, to the corporations, to the aid agencies, than they were to the citizens who actually elected them. Sound familiar?
Yes.
That was the period that's generally referred to as the period of structural adjustment. A devastation of all the gains of independence. And I think that was the thing. And just as in the period of the emergence of the Atlantic slave trade that Rodney writes about, where local elites colluded and collaborated with the slave traders to provide slaves, so we have the same phenomenon happening amongst our ruling elites. Something that Fanon himself commented on in a brilliant analysis in The Wretched of the Earth, and which was something that Rodney himself picked apart. What I want to show here is also a connection between two major periods of history. As I said, this crisis began around 1970, 71, 72. That's what began the decline across the continent. But almost 100 years earlier, in 1870, was when the last major serious crisis of capitalism occurred. And what was the result of that crisis? The result of that crisis was the need to recompose capital by carrying out what has since been characterized as accumulation by dispossession. You know, in the 1880s was when the Berlin Conference was held to divide up, carve up Africa. It was that period when the massive colonization and appropriation of almost the entire planet was carried out by the European powers. And it was a period, if you look from 1870 to 1970, what did we observe? We saw not only the sort of the genocide, the killings, the massacres that occurred in the process of colonization, but we saw also the rise of the First World War and the millions who were killed in that war. We saw subsequently a decline in the European economy, which led to the rise of fascism in Germany and the outbreak of the Second World War, which killed even more millions, and many in both wars were from Africa and from the colonies. And it took all that time until about 1945, 1950 for them to establish a 30-year period of quiescence, so-called quiescence, at least within the US and Europe and Japan. And that was the enormous price that was paid. Of course, what's hidden there is that, of course, America has never stopped being involved in war. You know, having been late for the last war, you know, they always wanted to be early for the next one. and that sort of brings the other side. If that was the barbarism that erupted as a result of the crisis in 1870, its mirror image was the fact that the first socialist revolution took place in some tin pot little country called Russia, exactly in a place where you would not expect it to happen. It was a period in which we saw a peasant revolution that led to the free establishment of a social republic in China. We saw the defeat of the French and then the Americans in Vietnam. We saw the emergence of all kinds of revolutions, including in Cuba and so on, happening. And above all, we saw the rise of the African Revolution. We saw the liberation of the, at least to independence during that period. So the 1870 crisis opened up the potentials for both an extreme barbarism, but also a period of revolution. And I would suggest, and it's something that Samir Amin argues quite strongly on, and that is that we are entering precisely that period. If anyone has any doubts about the barbarism that is going on, just let me remind you about Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. And that is going to continue to be one of the dynamics that we will see as capital seeks voraciously to accumulate by dispossession, if necessary using force to dispossess people of their livelihoods and their resources. But we are also seeing, as I've said, these uprisings taking place across the continent, and it's not just the continent, it's happening on a very wide scale. I interviewed a retiring British politician a few years ago, a fellow called Tony Benn, and I asked him about what he thought about, if he could comment on the economic crisis. And he said to me, we're not just facing an economic crisis, we're not just facing a financial crisis, we're facing a major crisis of confidence, a major crisis in which young people and increasing numbers of people are disenchanted by the structures of power that exist. That there is a sense that the ruling classes no longer have the capacity to deliver on all the aspirations that were there. And I think this is shown very poignantly in Egypt, where the uprisings which took place, they were a direct result of 30 years of dispossession, of structural adjustment, of declining living standards, of opening up the territory to international capital, to removing subsidies for farmers, a declining living standard, and privatization of the commons. So what does the World Bank propose after the revolution, when they are trying to establish Mubarakism without Mubarak? They propose an increased privatization, an opening up of the economy to international capital, and so on and so forth. The usual well-worn formulaic standards. On the one hand, it's depressing, but on the other hand, we should take inspiration from that. Because if the ruling class is in a situation in which it is no longer able to think creatively or deliver in anything else but the same old formulae, then there is a crisis for them. There is a real crisis. As Einstein said, you can't solve a problem using the same kind of thinking that created the problem. And I think that's the period that we are currently living in. And I think what's been happening today in terms of Occupy, what's been happening on an international scale, what we are seeing, the rise of protests in Portugal, in Spain, in Greece, and so on, is a source of immense possibilities, potential for social transformation to happen. But in those same countries, we are also seeing the rise, and an accelerated rise, of the far right, the fascist movements. So both things are happening at the same time. So I don't want to say that, look, relax folks, everything is going well. No. both things are happening. And the key factor here I want to highlight, because it comes back to Rodney's writing, and that is the subjective factor. It's not enough for us to say, well, we'll just watch it happen. Let's hope it goes well. But rather for us to take responsibility, even if we ourselves don't see the future, that it is our next generation who will inherit whatever we do, that we have a responsibility to engage and be creative in that engagement and to break with the kind of dogmas that have prevented many on the left from seizing opportunity. One of the disastrous effects, and again something that I think is inadequately understood by many, is the ideological effect of neoliberalism. When the dominance of neoliberalism is not only the culture of the CNN and all that, McDonald's and all that crap that you get fed every day, but much more seriously that we've observed, certainly in most of the countries I've visited and worked in Africa, has been that there has been a dispossession amongst young people of their own history. There is a disconnect. They don't know who Rodney is. They don't know who Cabral is. They don't know who Mekitelele was. They don't know our own history. The libraries don't have these books. Courses taught at university don't touch on any of that. We're back to a situation when I was in school in Nairobi, and I could tell you the names of every river in England. I couldn't tell you the name of one river in Kenya. We're back to essentially that time. And I think one of the key tasks that we face is to re-establish and reconnect and reappropriate our history. Because without that history, without our history, we're gone. We're nobody. We have no future on that. Rodney comments, the removal from history follows logically from the loss of power which colonialism represented. The power to act independently is the guarantee to participate actively and consciously in history. To be colonized is to be removed from history, except in the most passive sense. A striking illustration of the fact that colonial Africa was a passive object is seen in its attraction for white anthropologists who came to study primitive society. We might add also all the NGOs and so on who invade with their bag of tricks and SUVs into our countries. Today in Kenya, there are more Wazungu, there are more white people per square foot than there were at any time in the colonial history. And this was a settler colony. So it's really marked. And I think that leads to the question that, the challenge to this concept of development as if it was some sort of technical enterprise. It isn't. What Rodney puts across in his book is to demonstrate that it is a challenge to the voracious appetite of capital. It is the ability to take forward and grasp our own history to move forward. That is absolutely essential for going forward. I think often the sort of progressive movements in Africa are often dismissed because they have the arrogance. They have the arrogance to assert their right to humanity, that they are part of humanity. It's such a crime to do that. And yet that is the essence of what we have to face in any emancipatory project. I don't want to romanticize Rodney too much, but if what he did do was to tell that story up to the 1970s, and the parallels between what happened in Africa and the parallels of what's happening now, 40 years later, are quite extraordinary. I think one of the most important things about Rodney was his understanding of the labour theory of value, his understanding that it is not the robbing of resources that is the biggest crime that takes place by corporations in Africa. It is the robbing of labour, it is the exploitation of labour that is absolutely crucial and central to that. One can critique, and many have done, that, especially in relation to the title of one of his books, Groundings with My Brothers, that he excluded women within that framework. And I think that's a justifiable critique, but we have to situate Rodney in the period of the time that he was alive, where he was not the only one guilty of that. I think that he could have developed much further the critique, the understanding of how super exploitation occurs in Africa. Super exploitation is based on ensuring that the social cost of reproduction of labour is reduced to as low as possible. And the way in which capital has done that in Africa has been to shift the cost of the social cost of reproduction of labour onto the rural and predominantly the women. And that is the way in which the specific form of oppression and exploitation of women takes place today. But I think we have to understand it not just in general terms about patriarchies, but actually look at the specific nature on which capital operates in this situation. I have so many quotes I could come up with, but I won't bore you with too many. But just to highlight that this issue that I commented on at the beginning, that his work has demonstrated very, very clearly that the so-called growth, the so-called development that has been seen in most of Africa was something at the expense of the majority of people. That a small minority have accumulated vast amounts of wealth, whilst the majority's living standards have declined. And he writes, the developed and underdeveloped parts of the present capitalist section of the world have been in continuous contact for 4.5 centuries. The continent here, the contention here is that over that period, Africa helped to develop Western Europe in the same proportion as Western Europe helped to underdevelop Africa. And I think if we bring it to the modern period, then we are talking not just of Western Europe, we're not just talking about Europe, we are talking about the triad, US, Europe, and Japan. Let me leave my comments there. Thanks.
Thank you, Feroz, for that presentation. I know there are going to be a lot of comments and questions from our guest here tonight. Before we get started, I think you should, make some comments on the current strike situation in South Africa, strike plus situation in South Africa, and how that ties into what you were talking about.
I mean, it is shocking to see how the state has responded to the strikes which began at the Logan Platinum mines in the same way that apartheid responded. And one of the things I like doing when I speak at meetings in South Africa is to begin by saying, I'd just like to congratulate you, South Africans. You must be very clever people. Because what it took the rest of us to make mistakes over 40 years, you've done in 10 years. Okay? And I think there is a poignant irony here. And that the speed with which the South African regime has become a neo-colonial entity has been quite extraordinary. And the viciousness of the attacks, and not only the killing of 40 or so miners by the police, many of them were killed, shot in the back. But not only that, they then arrest the remaining miners for killing the others, and then over the weekend they raided the homes and shops. People
that was an apartheid law that they used.
Exactly, and Zuma has just declared that that there is no choice, because the economy of the country, i.e., the ability for corporations to accumulate huge super profits, is under threat, and so he is going in really hard against the miners. But the strikes have now spread into the gold mines and beyond, and there are calls for, Julius Malema has put out a call for a national strike in the mining sector. But I think this event has been is a watershed. I think it has sent shockwaves through the South African population, and I think this will change the way in which the people will respond to future actions. The importance of solidarity with the miners, solidarity with those who have been affected, is really, really important. And I think let me comment on that. I think we need to distinguish ourselves from the dominant paradigm of aid and development and poverty alleviation, etc., which is all driven by sentiments of charity. We have to transform that. We have to say, no, our sentiment is driven by solidarity, for a desire for social transformation and against injustices. And I think that's the kind of mobilization that needs to take place. So an affront to a South African miner is an affront to us all.
Okay, we will take 2 questions or comments at a time, and then Feroz will respond. Okay, so who wants to start? Yes.
Yeah, my question is, some people condemn Robert Mugabe, the head of state in Zimbabwe, but his development model seems to be somewhat different than, say, in South Africa, vis-a-vis the land and control of the resources that the country has. So, but yet some people on the left are very critical of him. So I just want you to comment on Zimbabwe vis-a-vis what you just said about South Africa. And my second question would be the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. What do you see that formation into the future vis-a-vis capitalism and the status quo?
Yes.
I've heard sort of many Oxfam types and Actionary types, and not just the sort of dominant aid paradigm folks quote Rodney, and they're trying to be progressive, but they perpetuate this sort of charity-based aid model, right? And even the title of Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, implies this obligation of the sort of colonial development of Africa in a superficial sense. And they're trying to do good, but yet, they're internalizing the lessons of Rodney, but they do it in a sort of neo-colonial framework. How do we use the lessons of Rodney in a sort of more structural way to address, the root causes of poverty? Things like tax, as you mentioned, and I know many people in this room know this, but, last year global aid to Africa was 120 billion, and the big multinationals stole about 160 billion in MNC tax evasion. And so tax, land rights, food sovereignty, food justice, even ag subsidies, right? U.S. corn trading 50% below the cost, so no one can compete. So how do we sort of use the lessons of Rodney to address those structural issues?
Okay, I think it's a very important question about Mugabe. I think people underestimate both Mugabe's political astuteness, but also underestimate the impact, the importance of the land reform programs that he initiated, for whatever reasons he may have done it and whatever to critique about the timing, etc. But concretely, although to begin with there was a sort of middle-class land and various people who benefited directly, were related to the state in some way, were benefiting. The reality, all the studies which have been carried out by people like Sam Moyo and others demonstrate that actually there's been quite a significant transformation in terms of land reform that has taken place, which has benefited much, much wider numbers of people. But that is not to then say that Mugabe and his regime has not been involved in serious repression and attacks on the opposition. One only has to remember a few years ago in Bulawayo, the massive massacres which was hushed up, but people in Bulawayo will talk about that. But one of the things that people forget, and you know, it often happens that this, you know, everyone's focusing on an individual, and one of the really important transformations which took place about 10 years ago as a result of Zimbabwe's invasion of DRC, including Namibia's invasion, Uganda, Rwanda, and everyone else leaping into the DRC, was that that was a period of massive accumulation which took place amongst the army generals and senior officers in the army. Their wealth became extraordinary, and their power then within Zimbabwe also shifted, so that Mugabe now is, in a sense, perhaps too exaggerated, but just to get the idea, almost a figurehead to the armed forces, the leadership of the armed forces and what they are doing. And now it's become even worse now with the discovery of diamonds and the exploitation of diamonds and collusion with lots of corporations, that this is going to get much worse. But Mugabe's did push for and made happen, whatever one might say and critique about how it was done and so on, did make some major transformations in terms of land reform. It's something which has a resonance in every settler colony across the continent. It's a major issue, and it is a major issue in South Africa. It's a central issue, and which is why South Africa has never been in a position to critique it, because they know that up in Limpopo area, there are peasants who are fighting for exactly the same kind of land reforms, and they are not willing to carry out those land reforms because of their association and collusion with corporations, international financial institutions, and so on. So I think I think we have to be much more nuanced in understanding the nature of what is going on in terms of these regimes. BRICS. I think that let me start with China, because I think that's one people most often talk about. China's entry into Africa was made possible directly as a result of the implementation of neoliberal policies. They opened the doors so capital could fly in, okay? And that's a really important point first to understand. Second point is that China came late into the game, okay? So all the things that they could have taken were already taken, okay? So the only way that China has been able to enter into oil, for example, was in Sudan when Bush said the ex-con and everyone else had to leave. That gave them an opening. The same thing happened in Angola, where the World Bank and IMF said, no, we will cut your loans if you have these kind of policies. China said, fine. And they've been very smart. They've used a very smart political venture to say, you know, if you want a bridge, have a bridge. And often there's an impatience that amongst our regime. They want this big stadium built by next year. Well, you know, to do that, they have to bring Chinese labor in. Okay? That's the reality of what happens. But you also have to look at China as well as Brazil and the others. You have to disentangle the state intervention versus the corporate intervention. Okay? Because there are serious corporations, especially in the oil sector, who have intervened in Africa. And remember, there's an amazing interview in the Economist a few years ago with one of the chief executives of, I think it was Sinopec, who said, look, we're a commercial enterprise. We have to work commercially on the world market. Okay, so we produce oil. If China can't afford or doesn't want our oil, we'll sell it on the world market. Okay, that's how we have to operate. Okay, it's a really honest thing, and that reflects something that's going on in China in itself. Because today, I don't know how much you've kept up with what the political struggles that are going around the Communist Party at the moment, and what we have is a growth of a powerful capitalist class in China, which is trying to carve out the potentials for becoming a very serious player, challenged by a more social democratic, more Keynesian perhaps, group who are saying, no, we can't have that. So that struggle is happening. So China's intervention in Africa has to be viewed in a sort of in a complex way. It's both corporations and the state operating in particular ways. Well, people say now, well, you know, but most of these Chinese companies are heavily subsidized by the state. But so is ExCom. So is, I mean, all of them. All the corporations, either by tax breaks or export licenses and all sorts of other clever ways of subsidizing. So you know, there's no difference in that sense in the way they operate. But crucially, their intervention into Africa provided an opportunity for our governments to play off one against the other. Whereas the World Bank and the Washington consensus was no infrastructural development unless it was privately developed. So no hospitals, no roads, no telecoms, all that. China comes along and says, you want a hospital? We'll build you a hospital. You want a town? We'll build you a town. So on. So it provides an alternative. My problem with the policies which they operate is that if viewed from an emancipatory point of view, you say yes, it might contribute to helping the economy in the abstract, but to what extent does it increase or reduce the capacity of our people to determine their own future? And I think there, if one looks and uses that as the litmus test in relation to any of the BRICS or the others, they are all wanting. The other thing I think, just remember, in Nigeria, for example, China has only 5% of greenfield sites. Okay?
5% what?
5% for oil. Okay? In Sudan, India is bigger than China in oil. In fact, across the continent, India is bigger than China on oil. If you look at foreign direct investment, okay, if you add all the Asian tigers together, add them all together, they constitute 1/6 of the amount that France does, which is smaller than the amount that Germany does, which is smaller than the amount that the US, in fact, smaller than the amount that Canada does, smaller than the amount that the US does, and the leading people are the UK. So, would you ever get that in the news? No, but it's always China bashing. And it's deeply racist. It's deeply racist because when they talk about American companies, they don't say the Americans are exploiting. They say, no, XCOM is doing this, Shell is doing this, whatever. But when it's Chinese, it's the Chinese who are doing this. Okay? There's a fundamental racism built into that narrative.
Thank you.
The issue of how do you use Rodney? I mean, I think the answer, in a sense, is quite straightforward.